Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Jeremy Schumacher. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. Thanks for stopping by and checking out my channel today. Today, I think I'm starting a three-part series, the three worst therapists throughout history. Worst is obviously an objective term. This is an opinion, which I will get into. And I don't know. It's a little clickbaity, right? Like, it's on YouTube, so chaos and like weird aggressive facial expressions on the title page of videos to get people to click is like part of the algorithm, and I'm willing to get clickbaity on titles but not do the rest of the work, I guess. So this is stuff that I want to talk about. I want to talk about these three people specifically. Spoiler alert, I'm not listing all three today. See, that's the gimmick to get you to come back. No, so I have my opinion of the professionals who have done the most harm to the profession, and by and large, like through doing bad work and doing things that are unscientific and having a really big platform in which they promote ideas that are unscientific or like scientifically inaccurate because of various reasons. I won't say narcissism because I don't diagnose personality disorders, because I don't think that's a good explanation of things, but narcissism or monetary value or just insecurity on their part have made them garbage therapists, in my opinion. So number three, we're going to go 3, 2, 1. Number 3 is Sigmund Freud, right? What a shock. The father of psychotherapy. Some people, I think, say the father of psychology. And if AP psychology taught me nothing but this fact, the father of psychology is Wilhelm Wundt, not Freud. Freud is the big, I didn't see anybody question this on all the critiques I've read around Freud. He's kind of the father of psychotherapy. He's really the one who took it and made it its own thing. And so, and that perspective, I guess it's hard to say like worst therapist ever, because how do you say the person who started the field that you practice in has done more harm than good? Like psychology and psychotherapy as a whole, I think has done a lot of good for people, but I would argue in the last 50 years, it's gotten a lot better. And previous to that, I'd be skeptical and say it's probably committed more harm than good. I don't have scientific facts behind that, but I certainly think there's an argument to be made. And I think there's plenty about how mental health was handled even through like the 60s and 70s. That's pretty bad. There's things about mental health being handled today that are really bad. So like, I want to get out in front of some of the common defenses of Freud before I go too far here. There are going to be people who obviously say like the standards of 2023 can't be done in reverse to 1902 or 1887 or whenever Freud started his career. I get that, right? Like I understand that obviously science has come a long way, and things that Freud did well through did poorly through hindsight compared to today's standards, like it's not a fair comparison. You can't compare somebody who has the internet to what he was dealing with. But I will say that like the things that I'm going to critique about Freud were things that were critiqued at his time, like by other professionals, by other scientists. So it's not like he didn't have access to the scientific method, which he just wholeheartedly ignored. It's not like he didn't do things that were suspect at the time and gave pause. He just powered through for various reasons. And I'm not like a Freud biographer. I have Freud's collected abstracts in my office because I think it's like a fascinating historical point. I think Freud as a historical person can't be refuted as far as like the impact he had. Obviously in the early 20th century, what a big deal he was and how he changed a lot of things. But I would argue the changes he made were bad. Like he set the scientific method back. He set science around dreams. He set science around sexuality back. Like he caused such a delay by being such a powerful force. So He got a lot of things wrong. I've used Freud as an example of the importance of looking at family of origin for a long time. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I don't do like genograms, and that's a separate topic. But the fancy term for family tree is genogram, that you can be used as like an important thing in family therapy. I just don't do it formally. I do it kind of informally, but I don't get out pen and paper and draw it out and do all the little charting. But Freud's a really good example where a lot of the things that Freud was teaching as science, and a lot of the way that Freud was practicing his version of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, is based on his personal experience. And so things like his dad remarrying and his mom, stepmom not being like much older than him, like starts to make sense around some of like the Oedipus complex and like wanting to have sex with your mom and kill your dad and like all that nonsense around sexual drives and repressed sexual abuse. Like all those things make a ton more sense when you look at his family of origin versus just looking at like the science behind it, because there wasn't any science on it. He was making shit up based on his perceived experience. He was also like an active drug addict. Part of he had two big like step backs in his professional career. One was a critique of his approach to feminism and how females are inferior to males and penis envy and all those things that were like just super unscientific and pretty easy to refute, but like easy to refute now with the science that we have, knowing that like he's just wrong on how human development even happens, like in utero and stuff like that. But we also know that like there were critiques going on from the feminist movement at the time, which like the feminist movement in the 1800s, the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s obviously looks different than what we think of as feminism post 1960. Just for clarification on like words and what meaning they have. But it's fascinating, I think, to know that like that was a big pushback. The other thing, my original talking point here was his addiction to cocaine, and like he advocated for cocaine usage on the regular. He wrote a paper on it. He was a big adamant proponent of it until the rest of the scientific community, like years later, pushed back. We're like, no, this is super addictive and people should stop doing it. It's really bad for them. Don't do cocaine. And he had used it. He had recommended it as a treatment for curing addiction to other substances like morphine, which again, like back in the day, these drugs that are really heavily regulated now weren't, and were like pretty readily available. If anyone watches the show Peaky Blinders, which is a show that I really like it covers that like cocaine was just out and about, readily available. Like rum was illegal in some places, but not cocaine. Like it's just a weird time. Not a lot of science happening, unfortunately, because of people like Freud. It's the whole premise I'm going to make here. So, you know, he was a drug addict. He had a messed up family life. Not necessarily like abuse that we know of. And again, I have not extensively read Freud's biographies, but it's one of those things where dad remarried, was born poor. His brothers, who he was, his half brothers, who he was pretty close to, went to school away from him. So like there's some stuff that just like hit him pretty hard in those early formative relationships that I think makes sense when you look at his family of origin and say like, how did he come up with such crazy ideas? Well, like was him trying to make sense of his lived experience. It seems like he then, once he got into things early in his career, he was making stuff up. He talked about like his success rate with psychoanalysis being 100%, which like, again, at that time, not just through hindsight, at that time, people were like, nah, bro, like, come on, that can't be true. And people were trying to refute it. And basically he was just like, no, you're all wrong. You don't understand it. So he kind of became like this big cult of personality around how good he was at it. And if you didn't follow his way of doing it, then you weren't going to get the same results. So like instantly working against the scientific method as a way to like test his hypotheses and basically saying, if it's not me doing it, you can't do it. As a therapist, like there is definitely like a push and pull. And as a young therapist who didn't know a lot, like I definitely had, I would say, more ego, not in the way that Freud used it, but like he's tough because like he has had a lot of cultural impact on things. for those who don't know what I'm talking about, like he created the idea of ego, id, and superego, and so like our word ego doesn't come from Freud, it comes from Greek, but like still having to use that word in a different context and then clarify that not how Freud was using it. He so yeah, as a young therapist, knowing like having positive results in someone's life is like a pretty empowering thing. Like it's really cool to help someone feel better. And so I think as a young therapist, probably getting a big head for him, and I've seen it in other places, I had to like battle against it. I'm highly critical of my own work, so it was more of like not getting too bogged down and like not perfectionism, but like right, an idea that a therapist is going to claim 100% success rate, even when like I was young and probably more full of myself than I am now, like still would have sounded ridiculous to me. Like you don't win them all in therapy. Like you can't fix people. That's not the point. Separate topic. So anyway, he did a lot of like unhelpful things. The way that he approached it was not scientific. He was making stuff up as he went along because again, he was kind of creating this. He had some co-creators that he worked with. Like he was around other scientists, around other doctors. He was besties for a while with a guy who was like a ear, nose, and throat specialist, and accused Freud of plagiarism. So like again, without getting into all the historical facts of this, and Freud's hard to study historically because he has so many like legends about him, but we have a ton of his personal correspondence to go off of. So like some of this is good primary sources that we have around his life and what he was actually thinking. But yeah, he had a friend who accused him of plagiarism. He had this friend who was like, hey, like the nasal passage is connected to the vagina, and like these are the ways that things, happen. So this person who has hysteria, which back in the day was like heightened emotional thing, but like was based off of like the idea of your uterus wandering. And there's so much stuff that's wrong with that. But basically, like, Freud's buddy was doing like nose surgeries unnecessarily to cure people's mental health because their uterus was making them crazy. And like that sounds so nonsensical. And like this is from somebody who like thinks highly of the brain gut connection and like knows that their connections are the body. Like these guys weren't like so far off base as to be like horrifically wrong, which is why people who are still like trying to defend psychoanalysis as a thing can make stuff work and say like, look, this study proves that Freud was right. Like it doesn't. Freud was wrong about pretty much everything. Nearly everything. And so like salvaging it isn't necessarily like Freud was right. It's more of like the concept of attachment exists, like the concept of repressed memories exist. His whole backstory of how those things happen and why they happen and how to treat them were all wrong. So like the fact that he was making note of these things, I don't think necessarily means he was getting things right or that we can empirically defend his work now. I think empirically over and over again shown that psychoanalysis doesn't work. It's unscientific. It is a pseudoscience. And all like the psychoanalysts who are still doing psychoanalysis, like pseudoscience, like, hey, they're chiropractors, also pseudoscience. People swear by it. Some people are like, have been really harmed by it. So it's one of those things. I'm not coming at chiropractors. I'm not super well versed in the topic. But it's one of those things where like, right, there's a difference between stumbling your way into this phenomenon exists in the human experience versus like his methodology and his assumptions and his writings were accurate. Like they weren't. He was wrong about nearly everything. The only thing that I'll get to is his defense mechanisms, which tend to hold up. He got a bunch of them wrong. Like a lot of them were still wrong. A couple of them still make sense. But like those were not things that he super explained well or like fit his paradigm still. Like they are explanations of a human phenomenon, not like a psychological explanation for why the things are happening the way that they are. So again, his whole thing, I'm going to back up and zoom out here a little bit. His whole process of therapy was known as psychoanalysis. He was very big on free association, letting clients talk freely. And then he, the expert in the room, interpreted all these things based on signs and symbols and who knows what else. probably well coked out of his mind and puffing away on some cigars while, being sexually repressed himself. I don't know. Like, he owns up to a lot of these things in his writing. And I think that's what's fascinating about Freud is we have so much of his writings where he kind of calls himself out on his own bullshit, like not in a self-aware way. Like, he wasn't being aware of his biases or constructive criticism. He was just like waxing poetic because he liked to talk. And like, we have writings where he gets done with a lecture and was like, I don't know if what I said any sense because I'm on so much cocaine right now, but I think the audience is so much dumber than me that no one noticed. Ha 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 ha. Like, we have that. Like, he wrote that. We have that, his own correspondence being like, I'm so much smarter than everyone else. And so coked up me is still better than everyone else. Like, there's a wild like insecurity about it. A bit of a thread in who I think are the worst therapists. I do have a personal bias for people who are not self-aware, a personal bias against people who are not self-aware, because I hold so highly people who come to therapy are saying like, I need help. And like, I think that takes a great amount of self-reflection. And I think that's a really hard thing to do. So I have so much respect for that. So those people who are kind of like, I'm infallible and I'm always right. And if you think I'm wrong, it's because you don't understand me, not the other way around. Like, that's problematic. So psychoanalysis, like, it's that classic kind of view of therapy where like client lies on the couch. Freud was like big and integral in setting some of the stuff up as like the therapist sits behind the person, like they're not in their periphery at all and is just like taking notes. And then at the end of session, after this person has like rambled on for an hour, the psychoanalyst is going to say what makes sense. But like, it's not even that's how we do therapy now, right? Like a 60-minute session and like try and be helpful in that time. That's not how psychoanalysis was set up. That's still not how true psychoanalysis is done. And I'll get into true psychoanalysis versus all the like neo psychoanalysis things that are happening these days. Psychoanalysis was designed to take years. So like Freud had some like wealthy, well-connected people coming in who he was spending a lot of time with, and the whole process is supposed to take a long, long time. He's interpreting dreams. He's reading into their childhoods. He's whatever. Very unscientific. So yeah. And like, I think the idea that it needed to take a long time is problematic because that's not true of therapy. Sometimes therapy takes a long time for certain people, and sometimes therapy is a couple of sessions. And like, I'm really big on like, everybody needs therapy. I have a podcast like, your therapist needs therapy. Like, I think therapy is good and useful and helpful for people. I do not think therapy needs to be rigid, and I don't think therapy needs to be years on end without like breaks. Like, if you come back and see your therapist every couple of months to clean things up or talk about new stressors, like, great. I think that's healthy. Way to use your support system. If you're in therapy, weekly therapy for 8 years, like, you are wasting money. Go get a new therapist. So I think it's one of those things where like he set that up, and that was problematic then, and it remains problematic now. I think now it's like such a money grab. It feels really like skeevy. Skeezy? Skeevy. I don't like the new word squicky. No. I don't know. I can't keep up on parlance of our time. That sounds right. But like something that makes you feel like squeamish and icky. Squicky. I don't know. Come at me, young people. Drop down in the comments and do that YouTube thing where you leave angry comments. So psychoanalysis was not very scientific. Freud also then created a whole bunch of different reasons that over his career were contradictory to his previous teachings around what kind of motivates the human psyche. He felt like most things came back to like repressed sexual energy, and he created like a life force and a death force and the struggle between these things. And like, none of it was very scientific. None of it was scientific at all. He was just making shit up. And none of it has been like empirically backed by evidence. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on it. He talked about the id, which is kind of like your unconscious bad stuff, and then like your ego and your super ego. And the super ego is like really rigid, and the ego is like the balancing force. So like, that's a good thing. Ish. I'm vastly oversimplifying. He spent a lot of time and energy and work fleshing these things out. But again, he was a prolific writer, and as he worked through his profession, he changed. Like, he had his buddy who was like doing, giving people cocaine and doing unnecessary nasal surgeries in his early career. And in his later career, he was around a lot of like big time thinkers and well-trained people in their time. So like, again, grossly like misogynistic and a bunch of straight white men running things, but like, you know, he was around big thinkers, and he was impacted by these other big thinkers. He read Nietzsche, but then like denied reading Nietzsche, but then said Nietzsche was like so good at saying the things that he couldn't write, and then like would also be like, but I haven't opened his books yet. So like, I think he was aware that other people's ideas were influencing his idea, and rather than like leaning into it and saying like, these people are great, he was kind of a bit of a drama queen around like making sure the ideas were credited to him. And again, he pulled in some big thinkers. So you had Adler, which Adler left, split from Freud, but was one of Freud's early collaborators slash students. Carl Jung, also a collaborator slash student who split and created his own school of psychotherapy. So like, Freud was influential in that perspective, but again, a lot of those people were coming from a presupposition of like psychoanalysis. There's an unconscious mind, and that explains most of our mental health issues. And the unconscious mind can be like fixed through psychoanalysis, which like isn't accurate. Like even people now who are doing like dream work and shit, which like instantly makes my hackles raise. I'm instantly skeptical of that because it comes from such an unscientific place. I think there are people who can do it well and say like, hey, these things like provide the meaning that you ascribe to them, but like that can still be helpful for you, in the same way that I think, you know, I'm an atheo-pagan, right? So like, I think not of gods and goddesses and deities. Like I don't, I'm a non-theistic pagan, but like, people benefit from reading tarot, not because it's predicting their future, but it's helping them process information a different way. It's creative problem solving. It's not predictive in nature, and it doesn't control your destiny. There is no fate, but it helps you look for different patterns. Like, you're just using your brain power differently. Like, I don't get super offended about that. Dream work in the way that Freud did it wasn't that. Like, so I'm skeptical of stuff like that. But again, like, I think there's definitely snake oil salesman stuff around some of those things. One of the reasons I detest Freud, and he's maybe popped back up on my radar recently, is because of Carl Jung and a bit of like weird wellness circles adopting like Jung's shadow work. So Carl Jung was one of Freud's students, early collaborators. Probably, depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different definition. And he came up with these archetypes of our personality and our subconscious, our unconscious. And so this idea of like, we all have these archetypes. One of the archetypes is shadow, which is like our bad stuff, yucky versions of ourselves. And like, his definition is maybe different than the definition of what therapists or wellness gurus are using now around shadow work. But like, again, just instantly raises my hackles. Like, it's not scientifically validated. It's empirically not possible to test a lot of it, because they're unconscious. So you can look at like things like Client Report and say like, sure, it's helping, but like, therapy helps across the board, typically at least around 30%. Like, it's better than placebo effect by a bit, not a ton, more than I wish it was. But like, any therapy, like therapy for years, for decades, for centuries, a bit more than a century and a half since Freud was doing this stuff, has been helpful to people. Like, the relationship you build with your therapist and having time and space to prioritize yourself is good for you, like across the board. So of course there's going to be some benefit to even kind of like snake oil salesman-y stuff, but it's not empirically validated. It's not evidence-based practice. We can't do it in a controlled setting, regardless of who the therapist is, and still get good results. Where we can do that with types of therapy that are evidence-based. So those are way better than placebo effect and have good bodies of research behind them. So I get nervous about like shadow work, and I don't think it's specifically Carl Jung who's gotten repopularized. It's just kind of this idea of the shadow. I've heard therapists talk about shadow work, and it's just like so bizarre to me to be, no, that's not a thing. And again, same with dream work. There's probably a way to do it that's a little bit more scientific. There's probably a way to say like, hey, this isn't actually doing much other than like helping you understand your problems in a different way. We're just accessing your problem solving differently, not necessarily like we're reading your subconscious mind. And I think if people get into that, like, this is how you untap, this is how you tap into your unconscious, like, that's problematic. We don't know that. Like, unconscious as a diametrically opposed concept to conscious brain exists. But like, as far as like what the unconscious is, like, I would say we don't have one. I would say there's certainly like automatic processes that are going on in our brain that we're not consciously controlling, but like they're not unconscious, and they're certainly not where mental health issues are coming from. So like, I don't know, it's just a weird, there was a big movement in philosophy to say that Freud's work was not falsifiable at one point, and basically saying that like it's so expansively like contradictory that like you can't design an experiment that will say whether or not it's accurate. And like, that's probably not true. There are people who did experiments and tested Freud's philosophy or concepts and said like, hey, they're true because they're super biased and they were psychoanalysts. Or the people are like, nah, this is not verifiable, but like, can we test it? Sure. Probably in the same way that like a lot of religion isn't falsifiable, like prove God doesn't exist. Well, like, you can't, because he doesn't exist. You can't prove that. So like, there's some philosophical debate around like Freud's work. I think Freud is, again, like an interesting figure. I think most of the work that he did was bad and unscientific. I think his students were also doing bad, unscientific things. Obviously, culturally, I'm not going to be like, oh, he was like misogynistic. He was, but also like, I'm not going to hold him to some golden standard of like, every society was misogynistic back then. It is now too, but like, some progress has been made. He was misogynistic. His work was misogynistic. The way that he treated women was poor. The way that he like diagnosed them was yucky and I don't know, sexist. So like, I don't think it's an excuse to say like, oh well, everyone was at his time. Like, that's probably an oversimplification. Obviously, things have gotten better, but again, like, I'm not trying to judge him based on like today's standards of like, he wasn't a social justice warrior. Like, of course not. It was 150 years ago. But like, was he doing things that were gross? Was he using his privilege in a certain way? Yeah. He had a weird relationship to religion. Freud was Jewish. He was identified as secular Jewish. So like, he didn't believe in God or Yahweh. He wasn't like a practicing active member of Judaism. I think, don't quote me on this, fact check me on this. There was some division in his family around like which of his dad's wives were which version of Jewish. And so like, I think even within his family, there was some riffs on like which sect of Judaism people were from. But he was an atheist for much of his career. But he like wrote like a weird book on monotheism and Moses, where he like made Moses into this legendary figure, totally devoid of like any actual data. And like, Moses is a legend. Like, Moses is not a historical figure. So that part is accurate. So I guess like, not a ton of harm in being like retconning Moses's story to be something different. But like, Freud really made it about like, you know, Old Testament Jewish people killing polytheism, or like their, I don't know. It was weird. It was weird. And like, he was still alive when Hitler came into power. Freud died in 1939. So he like had to flee Germany and like was held up and like extorted for money, and a bunch of unfortunate, like really gross anti-Semitic things happened to him because of his national heritage, not because of his religious beliefs. But like, he had a weird like later in his life, like, I don't know about Judaism, maybe like, but kind of weirdly attacking it, but then trying to like create a version of it where it was like way more badass. Again, not an expert in it. I've read a little bit on it just because I work in religious trauma. And when I see a book on like Freud and monotheism and Moses, I believe was the book that Freud wrote, like, it's fascinating in the sense of like, Freud's an interesting person, not as an expert in the field, but like as an interesting historical figure. So he had some weird things around that. He, again, like, as an atheist and as some part of his early career working in like neuropsych and looking at brains like of different animals and human brains, and like, he had a scientific background that he then just like set aside for uh, being the expert and making shit up as he went along, and he was a powerful enough force. Like, there are people who talk about his early meetings. He founded, which is a good thing, I guess, a bunch of different like coalitions and schools of thought and psychology institutes, psychoanalytic institutes at the time, that have morphed into schools of psychology and different entities, which I think is good. Like, collaboration is good and diversifying our knowledge base is good. And so those were good things that he did. But a lot of the early ones were written about and talked about as like cults of personality. Like, there was a very formal, rigid nature to them, almost of like a religious service, in which Freud got to kind of have like the first and last words, and copious amounts of tobacco were consumed. And, so some like, I think the things that we could say were good about his career and the good things he accomplished were happening elsewhere and like can't be attributed to him. So I think it's really like kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel, but the bottom of the barrel to say like, oh, he did this thing that was good. Like, he created these schools of thought. Like, sure, but that was like academia at the time. Like, he didn't come up with that concept. He, I think, had access to a lot of scientific method that he chose to ignore. He had a lot of critique that could have curbed some of what he was working on and made it more scientifically valid, and he chose to ignore it. He had a big head about himself, about how great he was and how grand he was, and immune to the effects of cocaine, I guess. He thought cocaine was good for you, I guess. So, and smoking, he felt like tobacco and nicotine made him sharper and kept him on point. He was using drugs to avoid masturbation, so like, it's not great. Which he viewed as the original vice. And, like, some of his famous sayings, like later in life, on his deathbed, being like, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, like questioning, like, how much did he control people's lives as an expert and how much harm did he do? And then to like, just kind of question it all at the end of his life. Like, I don't know. It would have been great if some of that self-reflection happened earlier in his life. I do think his defense mechanisms tend to hold up, like this idea that, but like, in concept, they hold up. As, again, human phenomenon and experience, they hold up. Like, we have things that are presented to us that we immediately get defensive over. Like, sure, a couple of his defense mechanisms still, I think, hold up as like human experience now. But for the most part, like, understanding cognitive bias is a much better explanation and a much better like, here's what's happening, here's why it happens, and also this is how we work through it, is much better than like whatever Freud was positing about defense mechanisms. So like, maybe that's some good that came out of his work, is that like awareness of biases and some of the cognitive shortcuts that happen in our brain that are inaccurate and unhelpful. Like, that's good to be aware of, I will say. I don't know. Again, like, on the whole, I think as a figure, like, more harm than good. I think the way that he did psychology and psychotherapy set it up for doing harm to people for much of the early part of the 1900s, really until the humanist movement kicked in the 1950s. And I'm not defending everything that happened in there, because we were still diagnosing homosexuality as a disorder, and therapists through up to like the 70s, maybe even the 80s, were like, I think through the 70s into the 80s, were diagnosing or were like prescribing sex with themselves for treatment. Like, that's messed up. That's abuse. That's manipulation. So I think a lot of that like therapist as expert stuff is garbage and is bad. Obviously, therapists are trained and highly trained individuals around the field of psychology, but if we use the word expert to mean like highly trained, that's good. To use the expert to mean like infallible, that's bad. I think expertise matters, but I also think experts get things wrong. That doesn't mean that average Joe posting memes on Facebook who get something wrong is the same as an expert. Like, just because people make mistakes across the board as a condition of being human does not mean that expertise doesn't matter. But certainly we don't want to veer into like experts as infallible. And that was definitely a perspective that Freud had, was like the psychoanalyst is, he, I guess, said psychoanalysts needed to be psychoanalyzed. I don't know. I don't think he was. I think maybe he would say some of the collaboration he was doing with people early in his career maybe counted. But yeah, like some of the people who were his students then, like were his clients, some of the people who he worked with, like his buddy totally botched this person that Freud was working with, her nose. He like messed it up, like caused permanent disfiguration. And like she went on to then be a psychoanalyst. So like again, his personality was big enough where he could kind of overcome these things or even work with people who were like specifically harmed by his work or his referral system and then keep working with them, which I think is pretty wild. So fascinating figure. I think did more harm than good. I think interesting historical figure, a really bad therapist. So he's number 3 on my list because at least I could salvage something from his career in the defense mechanisms and arguably the father of psychotherapy, even if he did harm for a lot of it and created a system that did harm for a lot of it. So it's hard to put that in the plus column for him. Um, So that's Freud, number 3 on the list of my 3 worst therapists of all time. Make sure to check back for the rest of the list, which I don't know when it'll come out. I'm not like not going to do it because I've had the idea for the videos for a long time as kind of separate entities. This is my way to tie them together. But I know that in my own recording schedule, there is some variance. So yeah, keep posted, like and subscribe so you get that little notification when the next videos come out. It does something with the YouTube algorithm. I don't know, gang. I don't subscribe to a lot of channels on YouTube. I'm not pressuring you. It helps. If you like my content, it helps. So yeah, we'll be back with more. Peace.